From Wondery, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Scandal. In 1953, the CIA launched a covert operation that sent shockwaves through the Middle East and reshaped U.S. foreign policy for decades. The target of the mission was Mohammad Mossadegh, the elected prime minister of Iran. Mossadegh had risen to power, promising to strengthen Iran's democracy. He was a staunch proponent of core democratic principles, like the freedom of the press and fair elections. But Mossadegh had broader ambitions, too. He sought to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which for years had been under the control of the British. And as he began carrying out his large-scale reforms, leaders in Washington grew concerned. American officials believed it was only a matter of time before Iran fell under the sway of communists, lending greater regional influence to the Soviet Union. So with the blessing of America's top officials, the CIA launched a coup, aiming to replace Mossadegh with a prime minister who seemed more aligned with Western interests. The CIA led a campaign that included bribes, staged riots, and the manipulation of the Iranian press. And ultimately, Mossadegh was forced to step down. But many have argued that in the end, the CIA's coup undermined America's self-interest, that it damaged America's standing as a global leader. And citing American interventions like this Operation Ajax in Iran, some critics have been calling for a radically new approach to U.S. foreign policy. My guest today is Stephen Walt, political scientist and professor of international relations at Harvard's Kennedy School of Public Policy. Walt has written extensively about foreign policy and is the author of books including Taming American Power and The Hell of Good Intentions. In our conversation, we'll discuss the moral dimensions and political costs of U.S. interventions around the world, and we'll take a broad look at the ideas that have shaped American policy over the last century. Our conversation is next. Stephen Walt, welcome to American Scandal.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now let's start this conversation by discussing a strange term, but one that's gotten increasing attention among people in the world of foreign policy. The term is the blob, and the definition of that is not incredibly self-evident. Could you begin by telling us what it means?
Sure. Barack Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, used the term, and it is used to describe the range of institutions, organizations, and individuals that work full-time on foreign policy questions, primarily in Washington. So it's not just the formal institutions of government like the Department of State or National Security Council, but it's really referring to the surrounding penumbra of think tanks, lobbies, academics, media, who weigh in on foreign policy and try and shape what the government does. And Rhodes used this rather disparaging term because he was trying to express the frustration the Obama administration felt that every time they tried to do something, they would face opposition or resistance or carping from the blob. And it captured what I think a lot of people understood about the foreign policy establishment, and that's why it caught on.
So there were some in the Obama administration that had this disparaging nickname for the group. What is the critique of this gathering of individuals and institutions? Why are they there to begin with? What problem do they pose?
Well, the central problem, I think, that he was referring to, and it's the one that others, those of us who've been critical of the foreign policy elite, is first of all groupthink, that this is a set of groups and organizations that you might think are always contending with one another, but in fact agree on lots of questions. There's a lot of conformity. And in fact, if you paint outside the lines, you suggest something that might be slightly outside what is considered orthodox or acceptable, it's not likely to advance your career. I think the second concern is that this is a group that over time has become largely unaccountable, that it doesn't want to hold each other to account because, of course, similar things might happen to you down the road. There's not much debate within the blob on core principles, on what America's role in the world ought to be. And among other things, that means the same policies keep getting repeated, even when they don't work very well. The same people keep getting reappointed, even when they fail. And in a sense, again, this whole community doesn't hold itself accountable. And as a result, we tend to make the same mistakes over and over again.
Well, let's look at some recent history to see if we can't examine some of the mistakes that are perhaps perpetuated by this groupthink or this over-reliance on core principles. Over the last 100 years, what has been an overarching theme or approach to U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I think until the end of the Cold War, if you sort of begin with when the United States became a great power, roughly 1900, right up through the end of the Cold War, the United States actually tended to rely on a pretty hard-nosed realist approach. There was sort of an idealistic veneer where we talked a lot about democracy and American values, but American leaders focused very heavily on the balance of power, on countering real adversaries, and we're not overly sentimental or overly idealistic about it. After the Cold War, however, I think things changed a little bit. Suddenly, the United States was in a position to try and project its values onto others without really worrying about what the consequences might be. And you've got a somewhat more ambitious and somewhat different approach to foreign policy that hasn't worked out nearly as well.
So in this post-Cold War period, I assume this is when the blob took hold.
Well, I think it's the objectives of the blob became more pronounced. The basic view post-1992 was that the United States should now begin to try and spread its values far and wide, transform as many other countries as possible into something more or less like the United States. So this was the period where the United States is now trying to spread democracy, human rights, security institutions like NATO as far as possible, without much regard for the consequences and without much regard for whether or not we knew how to do these things.
You point to 1992 as a year of change in foreign policy thought. What happened then?
Well, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union and indeed the entire Soviet Empire. That throughout the Cold War, the United States had to check its idealistic impulses because we were facing a serious adversary and we had to make compromises. We had to do business with governments that we disagreed with because they were useful for countering and containing the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union disappeared, of course, the United States, for a brief period, faced no serious adversaries. There were no real consequences, or at least we didn't think there were consequences for many of the things we were trying to do. We also, and by we I mean the blob, succumbed to a certain degree of hubris, right? We assumed that our victory in the Cold War confirmed that American principles were of universal validity, that the history was moving in our direction, and therefore it would be relatively easy for us to ride the tides of history to create a global liberal order under American leadership that would be peaceful, that would be prosperous, and could go on for a long time without much opposition. And it was that set of assumptions that I think proved to be most erroneous.
So it sounds like U.S. foreign policy for a long time has always been idealistic. But when faced with a strong adversary like the Soviet Union, pragmatism had to rule. Are there any other schools of thought within U.S. foreign policy that might be striving for prominence or was cast by the wayside?
No, I don't think so. I think you've really seen throughout American history sort of a struggle between the realistic impulses to focus on power, to focus on the balance of power, to, if possible, achieve and maintain a position of primacy because that maximizes American security, and then more idealistic impulses that are part of our political DNA, the sense that the United States is exceptional, it's different from other countries, it stands for a particular set of political values. Those two impulses have always been in contention. When we're faced with a serious challenger, whether it's, say, Nazi Germany in World War II or Soviet Union in the Cold War, then, of course, the realist impulse tends to dominate. We worry about security, we take that seriously, and we cut deals or we compromise some of our idealistic impulses. When we're feeling completely unconstrained and optimistic, however, those idealistic impulses can sometimes overcome a more sensible and realist approach.
But I'm wondering now if these idealistic impulses, the fight for democracy, the preservation of human rights globally, aren't also facing a new adversary in the self-preservation and groupthink of the blob. How do moral considerations actually shape decisions in Washington?
Well, first of all, I think you always try to justify what you're doing, regardless of what it is in moral terms. And I think it's very hard for people in Washington to openly argue against the idea of promoting notions of freedom or liberty. So whenever you go out to sell a policy, you want to frame it in terms of those traditional American values. If you look at, for example, how the Bush administration sold the invasion of Iraq in 2003, roughly 20 years ago, it was by reference to the need to topple a horrible, dangerous dictator to bring freedom to the Iraqi people. That wasn't, I think, the primary motive for doing so, but it was part of the rhetoric. If you look at George W. Bush's second inaugural speech, it's all about America's mission being spreading democracy around the world. And in that sense, it creates one of the default conditions that people in the blob use to justify what they're doing. And even a president that was somewhat skeptical of this kind of impulse, like Barack Obama, who didn't want to do as much of it, found himself unable to resist the impulse to eventually intervene in Libya, with the intention, of course, of helping the Libyan people, preventing perhaps a mass killing, but with the result of creating, in the end, a failed state and essentially a condition of anarchy there.
So I don't think anyone but the most naive observer of American foreign policy would think that idealism was the sole motivator for America's decisions. Pragmatism and self-interest have always been at the core of it. But without the confining space of a large superpower like the Soviet Union, without the need to compromise or perhaps relent on a few things, this unchecked impulse to do what we want in the pursuit of idealism has led to some unintended consequences and some actions that were decidedly not in America's self-interest.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the second, there's nothing wrong with American ideals, and in fact, we should be grateful that we get to live in a society where liberal institutions, a sense of tolerance, rule of law, democratic governance is still in effect. The problem is it's not a very good export product. And the difficulty is that trying to bring those values to other societies, particularly societies that are divided, that have never been democratic before, that have long traditions of autocracy, etc., trying to do that is essentially a massive social engineering project. You're disrupting one society's set of practices, habits, customs, norms, etc. You're empowering some elites, but of course driving other elites out of power, etc. It's a project we simply don't know how to do very well. So it's good to stand up for these values. It's good to preserve them here at home. It's even a good thing to try and make the United States a country that others will want to emulate on their own. But trying to take these values and impose them someplace else almost always backfires and leads, as you suggest, to a whole series of unintended consequences.
Let's talk about who makes foreign policy decisions that sometimes or often backfire. I mean, what are the basic mechanics of foreign policy? How much of the power lies exclusively in the executive branch, or as the Obama administration discovered, how much power lies in Congress or the blob?
So the executive branch has a lot of latitude. Presidents have a wide range of activities they can engage in, and the Constitution gives them much of that. And of course, they've taken more of it over time as America's global role has increased. It's responsible for executing foreign policy. It's the president who appoints ambassadors. It's the president who can order troops into combat, subject to some degree to congressional approval, but not usually a whole lot of constraint. So in that sense, much of the power lies with the president and, of course, the executive branch. Within that, the bureaucracy, of course, does a lot of the decision-making. Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Barack Obama are not making a lot of the micro decisions that go into making up our foreign and defense policy. That's being done by permanent civil servants who have the expertise, who've been working on these issues for a long time. So you often hear that the president has decided something. What the president has done is he's approved a policy that's been developed by civil servants in the bureaucracy. Now, that's not to say that presidents don't have latitude. They have advisors, and those advisors can be very important. If George W. Bush had chosen a different set of advisors prior to 9/11, the response to 9/11 would have been, I think, quite different than the one he ultimately chose. Congress does play a role. Congress, of course, has to approve funding, but Congress, I think, is increasingly disengaged from the day-to-day management of foreign policy. It doesn't have the manpower, doesn't have the resources, the expertise to really monitor what's going on. All it can do is approve budgets. And I think in the last 20 or 30 years, increasingly, Congress hasn't even wanted the responsibility. They're willing to criticize whoever's president when things go wrong, but they don't want to have to stand up and be responsible for most elements of foreign policy. You see this, for example, in the fact that we're still fighting the war on terror using an authorization to use military force that was voted in 2001 in response to the 9/11 attacks. That's still being used to warrant the use of force in lots of different places around the world. And the Obama administration actually tried to get Congress to pass a new resolution authorizing the use of force that was more appropriate to current circumstances. And Congress basically refused because they didn't want to be on record. So again, I think in this case, the basic mechanics of foreign policy are that a president and his advisors have an enormous amount of latitude, and the checks and balances that you might hope would operate don't operate as effectively as they might.
So then let's talk about the blob in general, the extending tendrils that go beyond the executive offices. I assume thousands of people, all with varying degrees of influence and power and experience, are working on policies and goals from very different viewpoints and with different aspirations. How much do people actually agree about our foreign policy?
First, I think everyone in the blob wants the United States to remain the most powerful country in the world. Nobody ever runs for president saying they want to make America number two. There is a strong commitment to trying to spread liberal principles around the world, peacefully if possible, but if necessary, by using military force. Institutions like NATO are essentially sacred, should not really be criticized. Nuclear proliferation is bad. Everybody agrees it's bad, but America's nuclear weapons are essential. So you don't find people in the establishment arguing that the United States should give up its nuclear arsenal. The so-called rules-based order is considered essential as well. The idea that international politics should be governed by a set of norms and rules. But of course, the United States should have the greatest influence to write those rules, and we're free to ignore them when we want to, as we did, say, when we invaded Iraq. In other words, this is a view that sees the United States as the indispensable power, has to be involved almost everywhere, and has to be leading the world towards a more peaceful and democratic future. I think these are all ideas that are widely held within the blob, and challenging any of those ideas is likely to make you something of a marginal figure.
But I think if you were to look at the headlines today, you might think that challenging these ideals is something we should really contemplate. Certainly, NATO has been in the news for the last 5-6 years and has been criticized even as it attempts to stave off an invasion of Ukraine from Russia, which is clearly not part of any rules-based world governance. China, too, often doesn't play by many rules and seeks advantage wherever it can get. It seems like this is a new state of affairs that requires new foreign affairs.
There's no question a lot has changed, but what I find more striking is the continuity even today. First of all, China actually does abide by many aspects of the rules-based order, particularly on economic affairs, and it's the United States under President Biden that's actually been departing from some of the World Trade Organization rules by putting export controls on, advanced chips going to China. Again, I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but it is inconsistent with the rules-based order we claim to champion. It's also clear that, when Donald Trump was president, he did challenge a lot of these orthodoxies, at least rhetorically. He was very critical of NATO. He saw American allies as freeloaders in various ways, and he, in some respects, questioned the blob's view in lots of different ways, but he didn't change many policies, right? The United States ended up with more troops in Europe at the end of the Trump administration than were there when he became president. He didn't actually end any of the military engagements that the United States had overseas. So in a sense, yes, there's a new world in certain respects. There's some people questioning some of these ideas in ways that they haven't before. But the basic outlines of American foreign policy haven't changed at all. And the American response, of course, to the invasion of Ukraine is a perfect illustration of this, where the United States has once again taken the lead in supporting Ukraine. Its European allies are doing far less than the United States has done. So even though the Biden administration wanted to keep things quiet in Europe and focus its attention on China, it's been unable to make that shift because it finds itself dragged back into trying to manage security on the European continent.
So we've been talking about our country's internal debates about foreign policy, but of course there would be no foreign policy without the rest of the world. So let's turn our attention outward. What do other countries think about how we conduct ourselves in foreign policy? Oftentimes, America is hypocritical in its view towards other countries.
Well, obviously, it varies depending on which parts of the world you're talking about. But there is a pretty consistent gap between how Americans see our role in the world and how other countries, even America's friends and allies, tend to see our role. So if you ask people around the world, does the United States consider the interests of others when it does foreign policy? Americans will answer that question overwhelmingly yes. 75% of Americans say, yes, we consider the interests of others. Even American allies generally say no. Fewer than 50%, even in places like Britain or France. So we see ourselves as acting for the good of the world, but even our friends recognize that we're not really taking their interests into account. We're doing what's in our self-interest. And then, of course, on some key issues, and Ukraine is a perfect illustration of this, some countries see this very much the same way the United States does. Our allies in Europe tend to see what's happening in Ukraine as very important, maybe the most important problem facing the world today. Once you leave that group, though, and you start looking at countries like India or Brazil or South Africa or Israel, they have a different view, or Saudi Arabia. It's not the most important issue that they see on the global agenda. They're more interested in ending the war than, say, achieving a victory, and they're not willing to sanction Russia because they see this as a sort of inter-Western or a northern problem and not something that concerns them as well. So I think it's important for Americans to understand that our view of the world is not shared in many other places.
I'd like to know more about your thoughts about this 50% figure of our allies, perhaps having a wary suspicion of America's intentions abroad. I mean, surely we as nations, Western nations, share a lot of ideals and a lot of objectives, and yet they still think America might be pushing their agenda solely and without concern of others. Where do you think the overlaps are, and where are there still gaps?
Well, certainly there's lots of countries around the world who are still, I think, dependent upon American protection, are grateful for it, and want it to continue. And that's something that we're going to agree on as long as Americans want to keep providing it in various places. But I think there are two ways in which America's allies are wary of what the United States does. First of all, because the United States is as powerful as it is, its actions are going to have lots of repercussions, even when they're well-intended, even sometimes when they succeed. Other states are going to be affected and sometimes harmed, even when we're not intending to harm them. And a perfect illustration of this is the American invasion of Iraq. It was opposed by Germany and France because they were worried that if we started a big war in the Middle East, it might eventually blow back onto them. And that's exactly what happened when the war eventually led to the creation of ISIS, and ISIS started conducting terrorist activities, including terrorist activities in Europe. That's one concern. The second concern that even our allies have is a function of, I think, the degree of polarization you now see in the United States. And the Trump administration is the perfect example of this, that I think these states now do worry that despite some of the consensus in American foreign policy, there are some issues where the United States is now acting like a pendulum, where depending on who the president is, you get one policy, you get another. Barack Obama signs a nuclear deal with Iran. Donald Trump takes the United States out of the deal. Barack Obama signs an agreement on climate change. Donald Trump takes us out of it. Joe Biden puts us back in. And that means other states can't be sure what American policy is going to be on at least some issues, which means they can't quite trust any promises one president makes because his successor might do something radically different.
Now, America's dominance in foreign policy and its hegemony is situated probably in its economic power and its influence throughout history, but also probably perhaps in its geographical isolation from other countries. There have not been any invasions or even threats of invasions of the American homeland for hundreds of years. How do you think this affects both policymakers and I guess the American public in general in terms of their thoughts and beliefs on foreign policy?
And there's no question that America's geographic location has been extraordinarily important in shaping our entire relationship with the rest of the world and how we've conducted foreign policy. The United States is the only great power in history that has no other great powers nearby. And we were geographically isolated from the European powers, and that allowed us to expand across North America, build an economy, and eventually become the most powerful country in the world. This was described by the historian C. Vann Woodward as giving the United States free security. And as you just mentioned, we've never been invaded, at least not since the War of 1812. Every other great power has faced warfare hitting its homeland. Even Great Britain lost, 40 to 50,000 people at home during World War II. So we've always been able to worry more about things happening in other parts of the world because we didn't have to worry about defending the continental United States. And certainly that's been true since 1900. It has one other effect, though. It means the United States can always come home if things don't work out. We fought in Vietnam. We lost 56,000 Americans there. We were there for over a decade. But ultimately, when we decided to leave, we just came home. We fought in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years, and eventually the United States decided to withdraw. We just came home. We can do that because we are here in the Western Hemisphere without facing any direct threats to us nearby. So I think you have to always remember that America's position in the world is fundamentally different than every other major power. I'll just add one other point. Because the United States is here by itself, that is to say, the only great power in the Western Hemisphere, it means that over in Europe and Asia, the other countries tend to worry more about each other than they do about us. And that's a huge advantage for the United States because it makes us a desirable ally. We can help them. We can help protect them. We can come to their aid if necessary, but we are not likely to try and take them over. And as China emerges as a major power, as Russia remains a troublesome power as well, that advantage still holds. It's what makes Europeans want to be close to the United States politically. It makes countries in Asia like Japan and South Korea and Australia and India want to be closer to the United States. And that's also a source of leverage that allows the United States to have some influence on them as well. And the key point here is, of course, not to let those commitments result in America being taken advantage of, for we do all of the work protecting these countries, and they do relatively little.
We started this conversation talking about the blob and the intransigence of opinion that they have about foreign policy and how difficult it is to stray from the orthodoxy. We also talked about how that has led to decades and decades of the same mistakes being made, whether that's from Vietnam to Iran to Afghanistan and beyond. So I started to wonder whether it's because the stakes are smaller or lower for America that we can just come home, that we are able to make the same mistakes without feeling the existential consequences.
Yeah, I think that's a large part of it. And I think in recent years, it's also been exacerbated by reliance on the all-volunteer force. So the people who do the sacrifices for many of our excessive involvements are volunteers. We don't have a draft. We don't have college students wondering if they're going to be pulled involuntarily into military service. We don't tend to raise taxes to pay for overseas adventures. We didn't raise taxes to pay for the Iraq War. We actually cut them. So we just run deficits. And what that does is it means that even when we're doing foolish things in distant places and things that ultimately don't work out well, the American people at home in Missouri and Michigan and Arizona, unless you have a family member in the armed services, this is all kind of over the horizon. You're not aware of it. You're not even aware of its effects. It's slowly eroding our position in the world in a variety of ways, but it's happening so far away and in such a disconnected fashion that people aren't aware of it. And that's one of the things that allows us to keep doing the same things over and over again, as long as folks in the blob still think those are the right things to do.
You mentioned that we haven't raised taxes to pay for our excursions abroad, but certainly we are paying for it somehow. Many people do not believe deficits can continue forever, and the Department of Defense has a budget that's reaching $1 trillion. It seems like any American concerned with a fiscal responsibility of its government should be very concerned with its foreign policy decisions.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, defense spending is a relatively small percentage of GDP, but it still does have big opportunity costs. The difficulty is it's essentially a counterfactual. You have to try to convince the American people that their lives would in fact be better. They would be better in a material and observable way if we had a more responsible foreign policy and, among other things, a smaller defense budget. The problem is, of course, people don't fully recognize that there's a connection between, say, spending $1 billion building a fancy air base in Afghanistan so we can run the occupation there and fight the Taliban for 20 years, and the fact that the roads are falling apart in their home city, or that they're having to pay extra fees at a public school if their kid wants to be in the band, or things like that. There are consequences, but we don't see the connection between the mistakes we may be making abroad and what's happening here at home. We don't recognize that we could, in fact, be living better here in the United States if we had a more responsible foreign policy. And in making that connection, I think, is one of the things that needs to happen. But unfortunately, it's a hard connection to make, and there aren't very many people in the foreign policy establishment who really want to explain this to the American people.
One of the dangers whenever we categorize a group of people or institutions like we've done with the blob is that we are oversimplifying something. Certainly, the blob is comprised of a lot of many individuals. Each are educated, dedicated, care about the work they do. So even though they may lead us to making the same mistakes over and over again, isn't there a compelling argument for why they exist, why their opinions exist?
No question. I mean, first of all, we ought to recognize that this is not a groupthink of 100%, that there are disagreements, particularly over sort of narrow tactical issues. Sometimes, should we intervene more in Syria during the Civil War or less? You get debates. It's not a complete mind meld within this establishment. What unites them, again, is this belief that almost all global problems require an American solution, what you might call an activist bias. Don't just sit there, do something as the classic impulse. Well, the other defense, of course, is that running foreign policy is complicated. You need expertise. You can't rely on amateur hour. You can't pull people just off the streets and put them in charge of the State Department or put them in charge of the U.S. Army. So you're going to have to rely on people who have genuine expertise. And like all experts, they're going to tend to like a particular set of solutions and tend to cling to them, even if they're not working out particularly well. But there is a defense of the establishment. What is really needed, though, is somewhat greater accountability. You shouldn't be able to go in and out of government and repeat the same mistakes over and over again and continue to get appointed every time the stars line up. And there's a long record of this sort of thing happening as well. We ought to be able to do what any baseball team would do: fire the manager and get some new players if you've had a losing record for the past 5 years or so. That's what you do in any business, and we don't do enough of that in the foreign policy world. We tend to reuse the same people because they're well connected, they have lots of friends, and we tend not to judge them too harshly And the result, of course, is you end up making the same mistakes over and over again.
Well, if the unfireable manager is the president, and they are difficult to fire, and the players are the entrenched establishment who are also difficult to remove, what other changes to the game could we make to move foreign policy forward in a more effective and pragmatic manner?
What I think needs to happen is two things. First, you need to have a more wide-ranging and open debate on just what America's role in the world should be, what policies have worked, what policies have failed, how can we do better going forward. Not have the debate just be between A and B, but really widen it in some respects. And I think there's some indications that is starting to happen. Second, you have to build a new blob, in a sense, up from the grassroots. You need to get young people starting out their careers who move into different institutions, moving into think tanks, moving into academia, moving into positions in government where they can acquire some experience, but who can bring a new set of ideas and a new perspective. And I think the most encouraging thing is that they do have a different view. If you look again at the opinions of Gen Z and Gen X and Gen Y on how they view international affairs, they worry more about things like climate change than they do about international terrorism. They do, in fact, care about a set of issues that are going to affect their lives going forward. They bring a different perspective. And the key is whether or not we can move them into positions of growing responsibility without socializing them into these old patterns of thought, so that they don't feel they have to just accept all the old think in order to have a successful career.
So finally, to bring us around to the topic of the series that we're concluding here, what specific lessons do you think we might be able to learn about the CIA's meddling in Iran during the mid-20th century? Is there any lesson that we should have learned that we can apply today?
Sure. There's at least two or three. So American foreign policy during the Cold War had a number of very positive features and a couple of huge mistakes. The positive features was our effort to build a set of global institutions that have worked remarkably well. Institutions like NATO, the Bretton Woods financial arrangements, our support for the United Nations over the years, et cetera. These were all developments in the early Cold War that paid off very well for the United States. Where the United States failed during the Cold War was largely in the developing world, where our fear of communism, our fear that it would somehow become contagious in that part of the world, led us to intervene in lots of places that we didn't understand, and almost always with unhappy results. Iran is one example, much of Latin America at various points, and obviously Vietnam as well. So when you intervene in another society, when you impose a political solution on another society that you probably don't understand very well, it will almost certainly have consequences that you don't anticipate. And the United States may have gotten a reasonably loyal ally in the Shah of Iran, although he was not by any means a perfect ally while in power for some years. But eventually, of course, when he fell, what was left was a society that was deeply hostile to the United States and blamed them for many misfortunes. And that, of course, now has been a problem for the United States for 40 years or so. The second thing you'd learn from that is it reminds us that different countries have their own national narrative. When Americans think about Iran today, they think about the fall of the Shah, they think about the Iranian Revolution, they think about the hostage crisis, they think about crowds chanting death to America. When Iranians think about the United States, they think about the 53 coup, America interfering in their politics, or they think about the support that the United States gave to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, when hundreds of thousands of Iranians died. The point is that we tell each other a different narrative about the past, and then when we try to figure out a way how to get along, we're bringing an entirely different view of the other to it. It's no surprise, therefore, that we've been unable to unwind this deeply hostile spiral between Washington and Tehran, despite occasional attempts by both sides to do this.
Well, Stephen Walt, thank you so much for joining me today on American Scandal.
It's been a pleasure. Nice talking with you.
That was my conversation with Stephen Walt, professor of international relations at Harvard's Kennedy School. and the author of Taming American Power and the Hell of Good Intentions. From Wondery, this is episode 4 of America's Coup in Iran from American Scandal. In our next series, we look at one of the most explosive trials of the 20th century. In 1968, protesters descended on Chicago in the lead up to the Democratic National Convention. Their goal was to push back against Democrats and their support for the Vietnam War. But after the protesters' clash with local police, prosecutors indicted 8 of the activists, charging them with federal crimes. The trial that followed would capture the nation's attention while becoming a symbolic battle about the future of America. American Scandal is hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham, for Airship. Audio editing by Emily Burke. Music by Lindsey Graham. This episode was produced by Alonia Minkowski. Our senior producer is Gabe Riven. Executive producers are Stephanie Jens, Jenny Lauer-Beckman, and Marshall Louie for Wondery.